"Grandpa, leave the house now." Those were the words my grandson whispered to me late one night. At first, I didn't understand. This was my home, the place I had built with my own hands, the place where every memory of my late wife still lived. But when I stepped outside and heard the laughter of my own children plotting inside, I realized the truth. They weren't protecting me. They were planning to erase me. What followed was the hardest chapter of my life: betrayal by the very blood I had raised. And yet, it was also the moment I found the strength to fight back. Stay with me, because this story is one you will not forget. I still remember the sound of my own son's voice echoing through the living room that night. Cold, sharp, final. "Dad, you need to pack your things. The papers are already signed. This house isn't yours anymore." For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My eyes darted to the coffee table where my children had neatly stacked documents, already stamped, already prepared. As if my life, my years of sacrifice, had been reduced to nothing more than a transaction. My eldest, Marcus, leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, smirking like he had just closed a business deal. "You should be grateful, Dad," he said, his tone dripping with false reason. "We've found a nice assisted living place for you. Clean, safe. You'll have people your own age to talk to. You won't have to worry about bills or upkeep anymore. Isn't that what you always wanted?" What I always wanted? My hands trembled as I pressed them against my knees to steady myself. No, what I wanted was respect, dignity, a place in my own family. But those things were being stripped away, piece by piece, right in front of me. Beside Marcus, my daughter Evelyn, the one who used to curl into my lap after her nightmares, wouldn't even meet my eyes. She just tapped her manicured nails against her phone screen, avoiding the weight of my stare. She whispered something to her husband, and they both laughed under their breath, as if I were some stubborn old fool who didn't know when to quit. And then came the blow that cut deeper than any wound I had ever felt in my life. My middle child, Daniel, leaned forward, his voice calm but cruel. "Dad, Mom's been gone for years. This house, it's just walls and bricks now. You don't belong here anymore. Let us handle things. It's better this way." "Better for who?" I wanted to scream. Better for them, certainly. Better for the vultures who circled me while pretending to care. But not better for me. Not better for the man who had laid every single brick of this foundation with his bare hands. Not better for the husband who had promised his wife that her memory would always live in these walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I rose slowly from my chair. I could feel their eyes on me, expectant, almost daring me to resist. For a brief moment, silence hung thick in the room. And then, from the hallway, a voice broke through. "Grandpa?" It was quiet, hesitant, but urgent enough to slice through the tension. My grandson, Thomas, just 16, peeked out from behind the corner, his wide eyes fixed on mine. "Grandpa, leave the house, now." Those words hit me harder than anything my children had said. Leave the house? Why? My gaze shifted back to Marcus and the others. They weren't even paying attention to him. They were too busy congratulating themselves, too wrapped up in their own victory to notice the boy who still had a shred of conscience. I trusted him. Maybe it was the fear in his eyes, or the way his hands shook as he gestured for me to follow him. Without another word, I stepped away from the living room and toward the door, my heart rattling against my ribs like a caged bird. The night air hit me cold as I stepped outside, but it was nothing compared to the chill in my bones. I stood there on the porch, my own home glowing warmly behind me, filled with laughter that wasn't mine, filled with betrayal I could taste in the back of my throat. "Grandpa, you can't let them do this to you," Thomas whispered fiercely once we were out of earshot. "They're selling the house tomorrow. They already signed everything. They're planning to move you into that facility whether you like it or not." His words cut through me like glass. my children, my blood, had already decided my fate. Not just decided. They had plotted, planned, executed, and now they were erasing me from the very life I had built for them. I stared at my grandson, my throat tight, my hands trembling with rage and disbelief. How could they? After everything I had given them, after all the nights I stayed awake worrying about tuition, about bills, about keeping this house standing so they'd always have a home to come back to, how could they? And then came the question, the one that lodged itself in my chest and refused to let go. When did my children stop seeing me as their father and start seeing me as an obstacle? That was the night it all began. That was the night I realized I wasn't just a burden to them. I was prey, and if I didn't fight back, if I didn't rise from the ashes of their betrayal, they would consume me whole. But this story doesn't begin with revenge. No, it begins with love, with trust, with sacrifice. It begins years earlier, when I was still strong enough to believe family meant loyalty, when I was blind enough to think my children carried my heart in theirs. It begins with how I raised them, and how, step by step, they learned to betray me. I was 21 when I first laid eyes on the plot of land that would later hold the Miller home. Back then, it wasn't much, just an uneven patch of dirt on the outskirts of Savannah, surrounded by oak trees heavy with Spanish moss. My wife, Margaret, stood beside me with her hand resting on her growing belly, and when I told her, "One day, our children will run through this yard," she smiled like she believed me more than I believed myself. I spent every free hour working that land. When I wasn't at my construction job, I was out there with a shovel, then with beams, nails, and calloused hands. By the time Margaret gave birth to Marcus, the house was nearly finished. We moved in with half-painted walls and a leaky roof, but to us it was a castle. Every corner carried our fingerprint. Every nail hammered was a promise that our family would always have roots. Over the years, the house grew as we did. I added a second story when Evelyn was born, so she could have her own room with a big window facing the magnolia tree. Later came Daniel, the middle child, and with him another extension, a study that doubled as a nursery until he was old enough to join the chaos of his siblings. That house wasn't just walls and bricks. It was my sweat, my blood, my life's story carved into timber and stone. And my children, God, how I loved them. I worked long hours so Marcus could go to the private school Margaret dreamed of. I skipped vacations and turned down promotions so I could be at Evelyn's dance recitals. I sold my truck once to cover Daniel's medical bills when he caught pneumonia at 7. Every sacrifice felt worth it, because I believed they'd grow up knowing the depth of my love. Margaret used to warn me sometimes. "Isaac," she'd say, her soft hand brushing mine at night, "don't give them so much that they forget how to stand on their own." But how could I not? They were my children. What was mine was theirs. When Margaret died, far too young, cancer stealing her breath in the space of a year, I swore to her memory that I would hold our family together. And for a time, I did. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Marcus, the eldest, inherited my stubbornness, but none of my humility. From the moment he turned 18, he acted like he was owed the world. "Dad, you built this house for us," he'd say, whenever I asked him to mow the lawn or help with repairs. "Why should I do the work? You already did it." He grew into a man who measured success not by effort, but by what he could extract from others. Evelyn, my only daughter, had Margaret's beauty, but carried a hunger for status that I never understood. She married young, too young in my opinion, to a man with money and charm, but little character. She became someone who cared more about appearances than substance. "Dad, that old truck embarrasses me when you pick me up," she once whispered, cheeks flushed, as though I'd shamed her by simply being myself. That stung more than I admitted at the time. And Daniel, my quiet, clever middle child, grew up watching his siblings test me. He learned early that subtle manipulation often succeeded where outright demands failed. "Dad, I don't want to bother you, but—" That was how every request began. By the time he was in college, those small requests had become tuition checks, rent money, and bailouts for mistakes he promised he'd never repeat. The red flags had been there all along, but love has a way of blinding you. I told myself they were young, that they'd grow out of it. I told myself Margaret would want me to keep forgiving, keep giving, keep smoothing over their rough edges. But the humiliations grew harder to ignore. Marcus invited me to dinner at his home once, a sleek suburban house far larger than mine, paid for in part by the money I'd given him for his business investment. When I arrived, he introduced me to his colleagues not as my father, but as the old man who built houses back in the day, as if decades of blood and sweat had been reduced to a hobby. I laughed it off, but inside I felt small. Evelyn stopped inviting me to her social events altogether. When I asked why, she said, "Dad, you wouldn't enjoy them. They're sophisticated. You'd be out of place." Out of place? In my own daughter's life? I swallowed the bitterness, but the words stayed lodged in my chest. Daniel, meanwhile, grew distant, unless he needed something. One Thanksgiving, after a lavish meal I cooked for the whole family, he pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Dad, I hate to ask, but I'm short on rent this month. Could you help out?" I gave him the money, of course, but as I watched him drive away later in his brand-new car, I realized I wasn't helping him. I was enabling him. And yet I kept giving. I told myself it was my duty as a father, that if I just held on, they'd come around, that maybe one day they'd see me not as a resource, but as the man who had loved them more than anything. But the older I grew, the more their entitlement sharpened. They began discussing the house openly, as if it were already theirs. When Dad finally downsizes, when we split the property. The words weren't whispered, they were spoken casually, as though my presence in my own home was a temporary inconvenience. I noticed, too, how they spoke of Margaret's memory, less and less. Her picture, once the centerpiece of our living room, was shifted aside whenever they visited. One afternoon, Evelyn even sighed and said, "Dad, maybe it's time to pack up Mom's things. It's depressing, walking into a museum every time we come here." A museum. That's what she called the house Margaret and I had built with our bare hands. Still, I ignored the signs. I clung to the belief that deep down, they loved me. That blood meant something. Until the day my grandson, Thomas, started coming around more often. Thomas wasn't like his parents. He'd sit with me on the porch, listening as I told stories about Margaret, about the nights I carried Marcus to bed after he fell asleep with his toy trucks, about the afternoons Evelyn spent twirling in the yard in her ballet shoes, about Daniel's crooked grin when he built his first treehouse. One evening, Thomas said softly, "Grandpa, why do they treat you like that?" The question knocked the wind out of me. I had never admitted to anyone, not even myself, that my children's behavior was cruel. But hearing it from him, so young, so clear-eyed, made me realize it wasn't just in my head. He saw it too. I brushed his hair back and forced a smile. "They don't mean it, Thomas. They're just busy. That's all." But inside, doubt gnawed at me. For the first time, I wondered if Margaret had been right, if I had given so much that they had forgotten how to love without taking. The small humiliations piled higher, snide remarks, dismissive gestures, cold silences, until one afternoon, I overheard Marcus on the phone in the kitchen. "Yeah, once the house is out of his name, we'll be set. He doesn't even read half the papers he signs." I froze in the hallway, blood running cold. Papers? My name? I stepped back before he saw me, heart hammering. That was the first undeniable sign. Something wasn't right. Something far darker than entitlement was growing in my own children, and it was only a matter of time before I'd be forced to face it head on. The day it all unraveled wasn't stormy or dramatic, the way one might imagine betrayal should arrive. No, It was a clear, bright morning in Savannah, the kind where sunlight spills through the oak branches like golden lace, and you almost believe the world is kind. I was sipping coffee at the kitchen table when I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel in the driveway. 3 cars, all my children, arriving at once. They came in like a procession. Marcus first, in his tailored suit, phone pressed to his ear. Evelyn next, wearing sunglasses too large for her face, her husband trailing behind carrying a leather briefcase. Daniel last, with a folder tucked beneath his arm. They didn't look at me the way family does. They looked at me the way bankers look at collateral. "Dad," Marcus said, slipping his phone into his pocket as though he'd just finished sealing my fate. "We need to talk." Those 4 words chilled me. They didn't sit down. They stood over me, crowding the kitchen, like prosecutors ready to deliver a verdict. Evelyn pulled off her sunglasses and placed them neatly on the counter. Her voice was calm, rehearsed. "It's time. We've found a place for you. Oak Ridge Assisted Living. It's modern, clean, with 24-hour care. You'll be comfortable there." I blinked, confused. "A place for me?" Daniel laid the folder on the table and slid it across as though presenting evidence. "You'll need to sign these, Dad. It just makes the transition easier. Power of attorney, property transfer, basic things. Nothing you need to worry about." The papers spread before me like a death sentence. Legal jargon, bolded terms, lines awaiting my signature. At the bottom, stamped in unforgiving black ink, was the word transfer. My throat tightened. "Transfer? You mean this house?" Marcus gave a thin smile, the kind that carried no warmth. "Dad, you don't use half this space. You're rattling around in here alone. Think about it. This place is wasted on you. We could sell it, split the value, and you'll never have to worry about upkeep again." My fingers curled around the edge of the table. "This is my home. I built this house. With my hands. With your mother." Evelyn's sigh cut me off, sharp as glass. "Dad, Mom's gone. You have to stop clinging to the past. You're not thinking clearly anymore. We're doing this for your own good. For my own good." The words tasted like poison. I looked from face to face, searching for any flicker of love, any trace of the children I had raised. All I found were hard eyes and greed disguised as reason. My chest ached, not from age, not from illness, but from heartbreak so sharp it hollowed me out. "Please," I whispered, though I hated how desperate it sounded. "Don't do this." But they had already decided. The following week, it became public. I arrived at church on Sunday, the one place where I still felt like I belonged, only to find whispers rippling through the pews. People glanced at me, then at one another. Finally, an old friend approached, his face tight with discomfort. "Isaac, I heard you sold the house. Is it true? Folks are saying your kids are moving you out." Heat rose in my face. My jaw clenched. "I didn't sell anything," I muttered, but the papers said otherwise. Somehow, without my full consent, my name had already been stripped from the property. Daniel, with his smooth words, had slipped documents in front of me days earlier, mixed among utility forms and insurance renewal. I had signed, trusting my son. And now the house, my house, Margaret's house, no longer belonged to me. When I returned home that afternoon, a for sale sign pierced the front yard like a blade, white letters on red, bold and final. My neighbors, the same ones who had watched me raise the walls of this house, walked by with lowered eyes. The shame burned hotter than fire. I stormed inside, heart pounding, and found them gathered in the living room again, my children lounging as though they already owned the place. Evelyn's husband flipped through real estate brochures. Marcus was on the phone again, no doubt boasting about their windfall. Daniel poured himself a drink from my liquor cabinet, as if everything here now belonged to him. "Why?" The word burst from me like thunder. They all looked up, almost annoyed. "Why are you doing this to me? After everything, every sacrifice I made for you?" Why would you take my home? Daniel set down his glass, his voice steady, patronizing. Dad, stop dramatizing. This is practical, logical. You'll be taken care of. You'll thank us later. Thank you? My voice cracked. For stealing from me? For erasing your mother's memory? Marcus rolled his eyes. You're being ridiculous. You can't even manage the bills anymore. We're saving you from yourself. The room tilted, my breath shallow. I wanted to scream, to curse, to tear those papers into shreds, but instead, I felt myself sink into the chair, into despair, into the crushing realization that my children, the very people I had built my life around, had stripped me of dignity and home in one calculated strike. The final humiliation came when Evelyn's husband looked at me and said, Mr. Miller, you'll need to vacate in 30 days. That's standard procedure. Vacate. The word echoed in my skull. Vacate my own life. Vacate my memories. Vacate the promise I had made to Margaret to keep her spirit alive in this place. That night, I sat alone in the darkened living room, the walls closing in. The air carried the faint scent of Margaret's perfume, still lingering from the scarf I kept draped over the couch. My chest tightened. Tears I refused to shed, pressing hot behind my eyes. I had lost. I had been outmaneuvered by my own children, betrayed, humiliated, discarded. But as I sat there in silence, something inside me shifted. Beneath the grief, beneath the crushing weight of defeat, there was a spark. Small, hidden, but burning. I said nothing aloud. Not to them. Not even to myself. But in that silence, a decision was made. A father's heart may break, but it also remembers. And mine was just beginning to remember. For days after the betrayal, I moved through the house like a ghost. The for sale sign out front was a knife I couldn't pull out. I avoided the neighbors, avoided the church. I couldn't stand the pity in their eyes. Nights were worse. I would sit in the living room, staring at Margaret's photograph on the mantel, asking her silently what I should do. One evening, as I sat there with nothing but shadows for company, I found myself whispering, I'm sorry, Margaret. I failed them. I failed you. But then, as I stared at that photograph, I noticed something. Her eyes, captured in the picture, seemed to be staring back at me with the same steadiness she had shown when we faced hardship together. That was when I felt it again. That small, hidden spark that had flickered in me the night of my humiliation. I had given my children everything. My money, my time, my trust. And they had used it to strip me bare. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I wasn't finished yet. The first step was simple. I went to the bank. I still had one account in my name only, one they didn't know about. Years ago, Margaret and I had set it aside as an emergency fund. Small compared to what I'd given away, but enough to serve as my seed of resistance. I withdrew a modest sum in cash and closed the account. It was a quiet act, unnoticed by them. But in that moment, I felt the first breath of power return to me. The next step came to me unexpectedly. While Daniel was visiting, he dropped off a stack of bills and letters for me to look over, sliding them onto the kitchen counter like a dutiful son. But his mistake was leaving the envelope from the county clerk's office unsealed. Curiosity, or maybe survival, made me open it. Inside were notices of property taxes and pending obligations tied to the house. I realized something immediately. In their rush to secure ownership, my children had overlooked one simple fact. Though they had maneuvered me into signing those papers, the deed transfer hadn't yet been finalized in the county records. For the moment, legally, I still held leverage. I didn't smile often those days, but that night, I did. I visited an old friend, Lawrence Bennett, a retired attorney who still kept his dusty office open downtown. We had shared beers in our younger years, and I knew he still respected me. Over coffee, I spread the papers before him, my voice low. They think they've taken everything, I told him. But it's not done yet. Tell me what I can do." Lawrence leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the documents, then chuckled softly. "Isaac, these kids of yours are greedy, but sloppy. The deed isn't properly executed. There are irregularities here. A missing notary seal, improperly witnessed signatures. Legally, this transfer could be voided in an instant." I felt my chest tighten, not with despair this time, but with something sharper, hope. "But don't rush," Lawrence warned. "Let them think they've won. Sometimes the best revenge is patience." Patience. I could do that. I had been patient my whole life. My first small strike came the following week. Evelyn had hired a realtor, slick-haired, overconfident, always carrying glossy pamphlets. He arrived at the house one morning to take photographs for the listing. As he walked through the living room, commenting on potential renovations, I quietly excused myself, went to the office, and pulled the breaker. The house went dark. "Ah, Mr. Miller?" the realtor called nervously. "We need the lights on," I returned calmly, feigning confusion. "Oh dear, must be the old wiring again. This place isn't as dependable as it used to be." He frowned, muttered something, and left with fewer photos than he wanted. Later, I heard Evelyn complaining on the phone about how Dad sabotaged the shoot. She was frustrated, unsettled. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me I wasn't powerless. Then came the matter of utilities. I still had accounts in my name: water, electricity, gas. Without those, the house wasn't livable, let alone sellable. One afternoon, while Marcus barked orders over the phone in the kitchen, I walked down to the service office and quietly settled balances, transferring the accounts into a temporary holding. When the bills came due again, nothing connected to them. The next week, I overheard Marcus cursing when the realtor called, "We can't show the house without working utilities." I sat quietly in the corner, sipping my tea, hiding the flicker of satisfaction in my eyes. But perhaps the most clever seed I planted came with Thomas's help. My grandson had become my shadow in those days, watching, listening, quietly sharing what he overheard. One night he whispered, "Grandpa, Mom and Uncle Marcus keep arguing about money. They don't trust each other." That was when I realized their greed could be turned against them. At Lawrence's suggestion, I drafted a simple letter, unsigned, on plain stationery. It was vague but effective. "Notice of irregularities has been filed. Current transfer is under review. Beneficiaries may be subject to investigation." I left one copy tucked in Marcus's briefcase when he wasn't looking. Another slipped into Evelyn's purse. By the next morning, they were already suspicious of each other. Evelyn accused Marcus of mishandling paperwork. Marcus accused Daniel of forging signatures. Their unity began to crack, hairline fractures spreading beneath the weight of distrust. I watched from the sidelines, quiet, patient, like a man tending embers in the dark. For the first time since the betrayal, I didn't feel small. I felt steady. The satisfaction was subtle, but it was there. In the way Marcus's smirk faltered when his realtor called again, frustrated by delays. In the way Evelyn's voice grew shrill as she argued with her husband about possible legal issues. In the way Daniel avoided my eyes, as though he sensed I wasn't as defeated as he believed. Of course, they still thought they had control. They still believed I was the tired old man they could push aside. That was fine with me. Let them believe it. The longer they underestimated me, the sweeter the victory would be. One evening, after they had left in a storm of arguments and unanswered questions, I stood alone in the quiet house. I walked into the study, the room I had built when Daniel was born, and sat at the desk. My hands brushed over the wood grain, worn smooth from years of use. I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and for the first time in weeks, allowed myself a real smile, because that was when I remembered something important, something my children had forgotten. I wasn't just their father. I was the man who built this house, who built their lives, who had weathered storms long before they ever drew breath. And I still had something left. The cracks in their unity widened, but cracks alone don't stop a storm. My children regrouped quickly, their greed pulling them back together like magnets. And when greedy people feel threatened, they don't retreat, they strike harder. It began with the letters. Marcus stormed into the house one evening, face flushed, waving the copy I had slipped into his briefcase. "What the hell is this, Dad?" he barked, slamming the paper onto the table. "You trying to sabotage us?" I feigned confusion, blinking at the letter as though I'd never seen it before. "I don't know what you're talking about." Evelyn arrived moments later, her heels clicking against the hardwood like gunshots. She tossed her purse on the sofa and glared at me. "Cut the games. We know you've been meddling. Utilities shut off, paperwork delayed. It all leads back to you." I leaned back in my chair, heart calm, voice even. "If you're so sure, prove it." Their silence was almost sweet. But it didn't last. The following week, Daniel showed up with a new weapon, a lawyer. He was slick, polished, and spoke with the kind of condescension only years in court can sharpen. "Mr. Miller," he began, setting a thick stack of papers on the table, "your children have petitioned for guardianship. Given recent evidence of confusion, emotional instability, and financial mismanagement, the court may find you unfit to manage your own affairs." Guardianship. My stomach sank. It was a legal trap, a way to strip me of the last fragments of independence, to declare me incompetent. I wanted to shout, to demand how my own flesh and blood could weaponize the law against me. But instead, I sat quietly, letting the lawyer speak, letting my children smirk behind his back. Gaslighting became their daily tool. "Dad, you forget things all the time," Evelyn insisted, her tone dripping with false concern. "Remember last month, when you misplaced your checkbook?" "That was one time," I muttered. Marcus shook his head. "You're confused more often than you realize. We're just trying to protect you." Protect me. The words were a knife twisting deeper each time. But they underestimated me. Again. Because I had already begun my counter. Flashback. 2 weeks earlier, I had visited Lawrence Bennett again. We sat in his office, surrounded by towers of dusty law books, and I laid out the situation. He leaned forward, listening closely, then said, "Isaac, you're playing a dangerous game, but if they're pushing for guardianship, they've made a mistake. You still have leverage." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were records, old property deeds, tax filings, forgotten titles. My construction company, long ago dissolved, had held several small parcels of land. Most had been sold off during Margaret's illness to cover bills, but not all. "Isaac," Lawrence said with a slow smile, "do you remember the cabin up by Tybee Creek?" I blinked, startled. "The hunting cabin? I thought that was gone. It never left your name. You kept it under the company, and when you dissolved the business, the title rolled back to you personally. Clean. Paid off. Worth a good deal now." I sat in stunned silence. Margaret and I had bought that cabin when the kids were little. It had been our weekend escape, a place where the children chased fireflies in the dark and Margaret made peach cobbler in the tiny kitchen. I hadn't set foot there in 20 years. "They don't know about it," Lawrence said, tapping the papers, "and that ignorance is your shield. If they're banking everything on this house, you hold the ace in your hand. The ace." So when Daniel's lawyer spread his guardianship petition across my table, I let them have their performance. I let them think they were boxing me in. Then, when the lawyer paused for my response, I slid a single envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the Tybee Creek deed. The lawyer frowned, scanning it. Marcus snatched it from his hands, his face paling as he read. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder, her lips parting in disbelief. "What is this?" Marcus demanded. "That," I said quietly, "is property still in my name. Valuable property. And it's not tied to this house or to you, which means your guardianship ploy won't get you a dime of it." Their eyes darted between one another, panic flickering for the first time. You hid this from us, Evelyn hissed. No, I corrected, my voice steady as stone. I didn't hide it. You never bothered to ask. Too busy circling what you thought was the only prize. Silence fell heavy in the room. I could feel the shift, the balance tilting, ever so slightly, back in my favor. But I wasn't done. Because I had one more card to play. The week before, I had asked Thomas to help me set up an old digital recorder. He carried it in his backpack, always running when the family gathered. He had captured hours of their voices, mocking me, belittling me, plotting against me. I hadn't planned to use it yet. But in that moment, watching their smug faces waver, I decided it was time to show just enough of my hand. I pressed play. Marcus's voice filled the room, unmistakable. He doesn't even read half the papers he signs. Once the house is gone, he's finished. Evelyn's laugh followed. We'll move him into Oak Ridge. Let him wither there. He won't last 6 months. Daniel chimed in. By the time he realizes what happened, it'll all be too late. The sound of their betrayal hung in the air like smoke. The color drained from Evelyn's face. Marcus cursed under his breath. Daniel looked as if he wanted to disappear into the floor. I stopped the recording, letting the silence roar louder than any words could. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Mr. Miller, Well, this complicates matters. If such recordings were made available in court, they will be, I said simply. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to rage. The quiet certainty in my voice was enough to make them flinch. That night, after they left in a fury of whispered arguments and slammed doors, I stood once again in the stillness of the house. For the first time in months, I felt taller, stronger. The battle wasn't over. Far from it. They would regroup, scheme, and come back harder. I knew them well enough to expect it. But now, they knew something too. I wasn't broken. I wasn't beaten. And as I stared out the window at the for sale sign swaying in the evening breeze, I let a slow smile creep across my face. Because this was only the beginning. They thought they had seen the worst of me, but the truth was simple. You haven't seen anything. The summons came on a Monday morning. My children had finally filed the guardianship petition, and the hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse. For them, it was the final nail. For me, it was the moment I had been waiting for. They arrived in their finest clothes, looking less like family and more like vultures in tailored suits. Marcus strutted in first, shaking hands with the lawyer, already boasting about the inevitable outcome. Evelyn sat beside her husband, whispering about renovations they would make once the sale of the house was finalized. Daniel, always the snake in the grass, gave me a thin smile as I entered. "Dad," he said, his tone syrupy with false concern. "Don't worry. After today, everything will be simpler for you." Simpler. They thought this was mercy. They thought this was victory. The courtroom filled with neighbors, church friends, and even a few old colleagues who had heard whispers of the case. I could feel their eyes on me, some full of pity, some of disbelief. An old man dragged into court by his own children. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Their lawyer painted a picture of me as confused, forgetful, incapable of managing my affairs. He cited the signed transfer of the house, the utilities, the alleged instability. Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with a tissue at the exact rehearsed moment. Marcus nodded gravely, as though this performance cost him dearly. Daniel stared straight ahead, as if none of this was personal. And then it was my turn. My attorney, Lawrence, rose slowly. His voice carried the calm weight of someone who had nothing to prove. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to present evidence before any determination is made." The judge nodded. Lawrence gestured to Thomas, who stood nervously but proudly, clutching a small recorder. He pressed play. The courtroom filled with my children's voices. "Marcus, he doesn't even read half the papers he signs. Once the house is gone, he's finished." Evelyn, "We'll move him into Oak Ridge. Let him wither there. He won't last 6 months." Daniel, "By the time he realizes what happened, it'll all be too late." Gasps rippled through the room. Evelyn's face drained of color. Marcus tried to lunge for the recorder, but the bailiff stepped between us. Lawrence held up a hand. And that is only one of several recordings, Your Honor. Recordings that prove not only malicious intent, but elder abuse and fraud. The judge's expression hardened. Continue. Lawrence laid out the irregularities in the deed transfer. Missing seals, forged signatures, improperly witnessed documents. He produced financial records showing how utilities had been tampered with, all while my name remained legally attached. And then, the coup de grace. The deed to the Tybee Creek cabin, still solely in my possession, proof that I was not only competent, but had safeguarded assets my children never knew existed. The gavel struck once. This court finds the petition baseless and dismisses it with prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering an inquiry into possible fraudulent actions surrounding the property transfer. The room erupted in murmurs. My children sat frozen, faces pale, their power slipping like sand through their fingers. But I wasn't finished. I rose to my feet, leaning on the cane I rarely used, but suddenly welcomed as a symbol of age and endurance. My voice carried through the room. Not loud, but steady. You spent months plotting to strip me of dignity. You laughed about locking me away, selling the only home your mother and I built with our own hands. You called me confused, useless, a burden. I turned to face the crowd. Neighbors, friends, witnesses. These are my children. And this is what greed does when love is forgotten. Evelyn whispered. Dad, stop. I raised a hand, silencing her. No. You stopped being my children the moment you stopped seeing me as your father. You wanted my house, my money, my silence. But what you forgot, what you never understood, is that I didn't build this family with ink and paper. I built it with sacrifice. With nights I went hungry so you could eat. With years of labor so you could live in comfort. With love so deep it nearly cost me myself. The room was utterly still. Marcus clenched his fists, his voice low, trembling. You can't do this. You can't cut us out. I met his glare without flinching. Watch me. Lawrence handed me one final document. I unfolded it, letting the pages crackle in the silence. This, I said, is the new trust. Effective immediately, the house you tried to steal will not belong to any of you. It will remain in my name until I am gone. Upon my passing, it will transfer, not to you, but to Thomas. Gasps again. My grandson's eyes widened, tears pooling as he realized what I had done. And not just the house, I continued. The Tybee Creek cabin, the remaining assets, everything, secured in his name, held in a trust to protect him from your greed. Evelyn half rose from her chair, fury written across her face. You can't. That's not fair. I turned to her, my voice calm, almost gentle. Fair. Fair would have been raising children who honored their mother's memory. Fair would have been respect in my old age. This isn't about fair. This is about justice. She sat down slowly, trembling. I let the silence stretch, heavy, suffocating, until I finally delivered the line I had carried in my heart since the night of my humiliation. I am not your wallet. I am your father. And today, I take that back. The words seemed to hang in the air, sharp enough to cut. My children had no reply. The smirks were gone. The rehearsed tears dried up. They sat in silence, stripped bare before everyone who mattered. The judge cleared his throat, his voice solemn. This court recognizes the new trust and orders that any further interference will be considered contempt and subject to criminal proceeding. This matter is closed. The gavel struck. The sound was final, like a door slamming shut on the life my children had imagined for themselves. As people filed out, I remained standing, Margaret's picture vivid in my mind. I could almost hear her voice, soft and sure. You did what you had to, Isaac. I turned to Thomas, who rushed forward and embraced me tightly. Grandpa, he whispered, his voice breaking. "You saved everything." I pulled him close, my chest heavy with both sorrow and relief. "No, son, you did. You were the only one who remembered what family means." Behind us, Marcus, Evelyn, and Daniel stood pale and trembling, cornered by whispers and judgmental stares. Their power had crumbled. Their greed had been laid bare before the world. And as I walked out of that courthouse with Thomas at my side, Cain tapping against the floor with each step, I felt lighter than I had in years. They thought they had seen the worst of me, but the truth was, they had only just seen who I really was: a father, a builder, a man who refused to be erased. The days following the court hearing passed in a quiet haze. Word spread fast through Savannah. News always does in small towns. At the diner, whispers followed my children's names like shadows. At church, where they once strutted with pride, they now sat small, avoided by neighbors who couldn't look them in the eye. I didn't need to punish them further. The truth had already done the work for me. Marcus lost a contract for his business within a week. The partners didn't say why, but I could read between the lines. Who would trust a man exposed for betraying his own father? Evelyn's friends, the ones she valued more than family, began to slip away too. Invitations dried up. Even her husband, that peacock of a man, seemed suddenly less present, less eager to parade her around. And Daniel, he stopped calling altogether. Perhaps guilt silenced him, or perhaps he was too ashamed to face me. Either way, the distance was its own justice. But I didn't spend my time tracking their downfall. I had no desire to. I had already wasted too many years wondering what they thought of me, hoping they'd remember what it meant to love their father. No, my focus turned elsewhere, on the one person who had stood by me without wavering: Thomas. He came by every evening after school. Sometimes we worked in the yard, repairing the old swing Margaret had once loved. Sometimes we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the moss-draped oaks. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight beyond his years. "Grandpa," he said one evening, his voice low, "I don't understand how they could do that to their own dad." I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me. "Greed makes people forget themselves, Thomas. It blinds them, and sometimes family is no shield against that blindness." He frowned, kicking at the porch step. "Does it still hurt?" I paused before answering. The truth was yes. It hurt in ways I couldn't always name. The kind of hurt that lingers not in the body, but in the soul. The kind that wakes you at night with memories of little children laughing, long before they grew into strangers. But I didn't want him to carry that heaviness. "It hurts less," I finally said, "because I know now that I didn't lose everything. I still have this house. I still have your grandmother's memory. And I still have you." He looked at me then, with a seriousness rare for 16. "I'll never treat you like they did. I promise." And in that moment, I believed him. Weeks later, I made a quiet trip to Tybee Creek. The cabin was just as I remembered. Weathered wood, shutters sagging slightly, but the air still smelled of pine and salt water. Memories flooded back. Margaret laughing as she stirred cobbler. The kids chasing fireflies with mason jars. For a moment, I allowed myself the bittersweet ache of what had been, then let it settle into something gentler. Not loss, but remembrance. I decided then that the cabin would become a refuge again, not for my children, but for Thomas. A place where he could learn what family really meant, where he could bring his friends, his future children, and tell them stories about the grandfather who refused to be erased. The nights grew softer after that. I no longer sat in the dark, haunted by betrayal. Instead, I sat in the light of memory and possibility. Margaret's picture still on the mantel, Thomas's laughter echoing through the halls. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a home again. One evening, as I closed the blinds against the fading sun, I remembered that night, the one where Thomas whispered, "Grandpa, Leave the house now. At the time, I thought it was the beginning of the end, but looking back, I realized it had been the opposite. It was the beginning of my rebirth, the spark that woke me from despair. My children had tried to bury me in silence, but instead, they had taught me something vital. That respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. That aging does not make you weak. It only makes you wiser. And that betrayal, no matter how sharp, cannot erase a life built on love and sacrifice. I may have lost them, but I had gained clarity. I had found strength again. And perhaps most importantly, I had secured the future for the one who truly deserved it. As I sat on the porch that final evening of summer, Thomas beside me, fireflies glowing in the yard, just as they had when his mother was a child, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I turned to him and said softly, "Remember this, Thomas. Wealth can be stolen, homes can be sold, but love and respect, that's the true inheritance. Without those, no fortune will last. With them, even an old man has all he needs." He nodded, his eyes shining, and in the quiet hum of the night, I knew the story had come full circle. They had tried to take everything from me. But in the end, they had only freed me to see the truth. Blood makes you related. Love makes you family. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts, or even your own experiences, down in the comment. Your words mean more than you know, and they help this community grow. If you haven't already, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Every click of support keeps these stories alive and brings more people into the circle. Until next time, take care of yourself and never forget the value of love and respect.